Happy Monday. Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Jewett. Thank you so much for joining us here today for the first day of Techstars Startup Week Atlanta, the first but certainly not the last. I am so honored to host this conversation, what I think is an extremely timely conversation, given all that is going on. So the topic is HR empowerment, the cost of good company culture. And we have two illustrious, esteemed panelists who know just the kind of advice and tips and strategy that startups really need in order to not only create a positive company culture, but to help you develop it and to save you a world of hurt later that so many of us as startup founders have not done the best job of navigating. So we're going to get this started by having our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. And Jeannie, why don't we start with you?
So my name is Jeannie Marks. I am an attorney in my own law firm is Marks and Marks. We are located based in Atlanta, Georgia. My law partner and I have had Marks and Marks since 1991, and I started my career in 1987. We do employment discrimination litigation and civil rights litigation and whistleblower litigation. So it's the full panoply of race, age, sex, sexual harassment, pay equity, all the statutes, all the retaliation statutes, whistleblower claims. I'm very proud that we've made some good law. I started my career representing companies. And over the last few years, our firm primarily focuses on representing plaintiffs, although we do counsel companies in terms of best practices and how to avoid hiring people like us. So that's what I do.
You're amazing, Jeannie. My name is Elaine Jacques, and I am an executive coach with U Plus 1% Today, a company that I founded. And I formerly was also human resources for a tiny little firm called Frito-Lay, a subsidiary of PepsiCo, which probably everyone knows. And I've also worked for a tech startup in Silicon Valley.
Fantastic. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, the viewers, our audience. We will take, if you have burning questions throughout our chat, please feel free to drop them, but ideally we will answer the bulk of them at the end. But, you know, since this is called HR empowerment, and it is about creating good company culture, let's start at the base, getting everybody on the same page. What is, and this is for either Elaine or Jeannie, what is the definition of company culture, period? What does it mean to have company culture?
Elaine, I'm going to let
you. For me, company culture is the I like to call them the rules of engagement. How the team, how the company as a whole, however big or small it is, decides that they're going to interact with each other. Obviously, the best company culture is one that I like to say is based on a foundation of mutual respect and a desire to really promote each other and the good of the company and each individual as an overall whole.
Fantastic. And so, is there anything you want to add, Jeannie, as far as what your experience has been on the legal side of company culture?
So I think that it starts with an understanding from the get-go that HR is not a stepchild of other important concerns of startups like equity splits and IP issues, and that the foundation really needs to get discussed and get laid really from the get-go is what I would, and that opens a whole lot of doors, but that would be that's certainly something I think is important to recognize right from the beginning.
So that is a fantastic segue, because as a founder, company culture is something when you're just trying to build a product, you're trying to ship something out, you're just trying to raise money, you're doing all these things, and that is something that when you're spread so thin can fall to the back of founders' mind. But as your point, it is really important. So why does it matter? Because it's something we don't think about until there's a problem. So now that we know what company culture is, and I loved, the rules of engagement, how you're planning to promote each other and how you're going to engage and work with each other. So how do you find good company culture now that we know what company culture is? And anyone can answer.
Okay, well, I'll kind of jump into this. I think that so certainly from the point of view of diversity issues, there's a whole constellation of different kinds of issues. So issues regarding all kinds of diversity, gender, race, that whole thing, and having those kinds of discussions from the beginning, I think, are important. Ideas around the issue of unconscious biases, actually bringing that to the fore as something that is discussed openly, and inviting discussion about those issues, because sometimes people act inadvertently. And my experience is kind of in a global way, when people feel invisible and then not heard, quickly that dissatisfaction jettisons into something then that could spiral out of control in terms of legal action. And it's very hard to kind of put that toothpaste back in the tube. So I think there's a certain level of mindfulness that if companies can begin to focus on these kinds of issues at the beginning, again, going back to the building blocks idea and the foundational ideas, as your company grows, you've put in place processes and a certain level of mindfulness that now you don't have to kind of overlay your beginning steps. It's part of your root system. And I like that.
Fantastic definition, Anna, and I love that you included, really it's everything that we've been experiencing as a nation and even globally, especially in the tech world, the unconscious bias, issues of race and sex and age. So really pivotal to understand how if we're mindful about it as founders, how we can create this positive. Elaine, what are some good steps in order to avoid the lack of mindfulness and letting things, to Jeannie's point, get to the point where we need to take legal action, or your employees take legal action? What are some of those foundational blocks that you'd like to share that founders are overlooking, not considering, that create that positive workplace with that mindfulness piece?
I think I just have to compliment Jeannie. I love that put the toothpaste back in the tube thing, because we all know how hard that is. So I love that analogy, because really prevention and laying the foundation is so important at the early stages. Companies that I have worked with in the early stages have done things like say, communication is going to be so important that we make it part of our weekly schedule, that we schedule time, we have blocks, that the founding people will set aside time that says, this is my open door policy time frame. These are times when I need to get my stuff done too. And so emergencies only, but everyone knows that there are these set blocks on their schedule when they can come with questions. And not only that, just, come if you have questions, but setting up times with each of the people that are involved in your leadership team to say, this is when we're going to communicate, so that we have times where we catch things before they become problems. And I like to encourage founders to do things like assessments. There are some free assessments like the Values and Actions Survey. I think Ali Merritt, one of the organizers for this wonderful event, also mentioned, the love languages. Recently, I became aware that the love languages company not only has the 5 love languages, but they also have an apology quiz that you can take to determine your type of apology. And I will tell you, that was very enlightening to me, because I know that there have been times in the workplace where someone has said or indicated that they were apologetic, and I didn't really feel it, and I didn't understand why. And that can be really big in that coming at something with your own perspective, the biases, is to recognize that sometimes even the way we communicate that we're sorry cannot land for someone, just like how we communicate love, in not in the romantic but in the work sense of acts of service versus words of affirmation. And those are the kinds of things that I really encourage people to make a foundational part, and for each and every person who joins your team, that process be repeated, so that that new person feels completely included and understands where everyone else is at, because those things will change over time. One of the companies that I've worked with has had me come back with each new leadership team member, and it's been very enlightening for them to see how their quote results on these various assessments have changed over time based on, oh, one of them has had a baby now, one of them has bought a home, and other things in their life have changed. So it changes what they value most. And those can include things like how much stability matters to them, how much security matters to them. And as those things change, you're going to be more risk averse to trying new things, to trying out innovations, and recognizing that, hey, you know, when I've come to you before, you've been really open to it and now you're not. And recognizing what other factors may be contributing to that, so that you don't get into the, I don't feel valued, I don't feel like I'm being trusted, and those kinds of things that bring you to someone like Jeannie when you become very disgruntled and don't understand how you really fit anymore.
I wanted to say that that as a founder, you know, I'm going to ask questions that are things that I have experienced, and I have a lot of friends and peers that are in the startup world, and that is one of the hardest things. You don't think about how important it is to carve out that time. So early in my startup journey, as I built my team, I'd be like, oh yeah, we're going to meet on Thursdays, 1-to-1. And then things pile up and you're like, never mind, I can't meet Thursday. And how important it is to maintain that time and that integrity, because if you're just asking people blanketly, hey, let me know if something's wrong, most people will never actually tell you something's wrong until you sit them in front of you. And you're like, hey, what do you have on your mind? It is something that is really easy as a founder to push off, and you don't do it in a malicious way, but you're just, the weight of the world is on you. But it makes all the difference when people really know there's a safe time parameter with the boss or with the leadership to lay out what they're feeling. And to both of your points, it really does allow the prevention of things escalating, and also keeping your employees happy, and especially the startup when you cannot afford turnover. So are there specific instances, and you know, we've chatted about some pretty intense situations. Some have ended well and others not so great. Are there any examples you'd like to share about when best practices weren't implemented and how that has affected the startup culture, or the inverse as well?
So I want to jump in here for a moment, and so one point I think could be very helpful. I think proactively, as founders, you know, any beginning company is starting to think through what they would do under different scenarios. They need to think about, what do they do when they learn about a potential rogue employee, rather than when that situation is upon them, an untoward sexual advance. Whether, now, small companies often have events and lead, their operations are not limited to the workplace world, you know, walls. And right now we have very fluid kinds of walls and what that all looks like. But you know, what are you going to do? Because there's a lot of pressure. There can be a lot of pressure in the moment when you have a substantial producer, a pivotal person in terms of different kinds of relationships, who may be acting in ways that are problematic. And I think if a founder thinks through in advance what the response is, has kind of a stock kind of plan in mind, it's not so overwhelming, and it's less easy. It's less easy to impel that person to avoid the situation, which is a terrible response.
So what you would say is, like, in a pre-COVID and possibly post-COVID world, when we're back to some semblance of a happy hour, or you are a startup and someone goes to someone's apartment as a team for drinks or hangs out, and things might get a little interesting or weird, or someone makes a comment, is what you're saying, like, to think in advance, what would you do? And I think that's something we don't think about as startups and as founders. You're just like, yeah, let's go to someone's house and have drinks, or let's hang at the bar, again, in a post-COVID world. But so it is a matter in what you've said of thinking through those things in advance. Like, how are you going to handle that?
And in general, if you learn through either you learn directly or you learn through the grapevine that there's an employee that's possibly breaking the law, I think it becomes very onerous to have to start thinking through what that process is in that moment, when you might feel the financial pressure of the fabulous producer and you have the disgruntled employee, and emotions are in a frayed position at that point. And I just think it's very helpful to avoid, let's say, like situational ethics or situational decision making, and have in mind some kind of plan how you're going to approach this kind of situation. Because in my practice, I see that happens all the time, and we've seen it in the press. I mean, the Weinstein situation, Matt Lauer. I mean, these are not unique situations. These situations are very common.
So if you had to say something, if you had to name a couple of these areas that as a founder, you don't want to be behind the eight ball. You want to think ahead, even if you don't have it all strategized, you don't have it all planned out. What are some things founders should have top of mind? Some of the areas, like, what should I do if someone makes an unwanted sexual advance? Or are there a couple of areas that you're like, hey, you're early stage now, but you should start thinking about this early of how you'd handle that? And Elaine, feel free to jump in if there's things. This is where I've seen people really get messed up by not thinking ahead.
Elaine? So I would say that there are a few things. I think that initially founders would be well advised to consult an attorney, consult an employment attorney, same way they would consult an IP attorney or a corporate attorney, just so that they can get the lay of the land. I think it's very helpful to put into writing and have some kind of policy, certainly at least to have the discussion about what is sexual harassment, for example, that kind of thing, or to talk about terms that may be widely used but could be perceived as offensive. I see some companies do so that people talk about training, and training is a very ambiguous kind of word. It could be really boring, like online training, and nobody's really paying attention to it. Or I've seen, and I've been very impressed by companies that do kind of on a regular kind of basis, like role play, for example. Like, what would you do? How do you handle this kind of situation? Is the person getting really upset? What are the obligations, or what are the correct actions maybe of somebody who's maybe in some supervisory level, not in a direct supervisory line, but observes behavior? I think at the end of the day, it all starts with the founder defining what is over the line and what's not over the line, and not being ambiguous about that.
When should a founder lay those things out? If we looked at that, when should a founder, hey, we're hiring somebody new, or we're a new team, we're coming together, when is the best time? Is it the day that they're hired? Is it a week later? Is it 6 months in? When is like a good time and way to approach, like, hey, these are the no-nos for us and this is not okay?
Okay, so out of the box. I think that along with corporate documents that founding companies may put in place, to get themselves up and running, I think it behooves them to put together some kind of HR document that lays out behaviors and to have the discussion. If there is more than one founder among supervisory people, exactly what behaviors are going to be over the line. Certainly need to, it would be helpful for somebody to speak to somebody who knows about what kinds of behaviors are over the line. Not every behavior is over the line. I mean, obviously that's true. But then I think it needs to be reduced to writing. And I think it's a very important point. And then the distribution of that writing has to be unambiguous. So putting some kind of policy, some HR policy or complaint that should include a complaint procedure, putting that in application materials online, for example, that's not going to work. Or shoving them into onboarding materials, all of those initial documents that someone has to fill out when they start working. That's really not an effective distribution of a policy that an employer might later claim is their policy. It has to be effective, and it's got to have teeth, and you've got to put your money where your mouth is. So I think at the beginning.
So to kind of summarize, like how founders should be thinking about this from the onset, having certain topics in mind, putting them down in an HR document is really important. Being clear that these are areas that, are not acceptable. The behavior is not acceptable within the company. Making sure that we're intentional about how we distribute it. It can't just be buried in a packet. It really has to be something that is given the space and the time to breathe, because later, should it unfortunately get to a point where there's litigation possibly involved, you want to be able to have protected yourself and protected the company culture in the workplace. And so I love that. And so now that we have this kind of framework of what a founder should think from the very beginning, from the onset, Elaine, what might be some strategies for dealing? Let's go back to that example, the scenario. Let's say you have a star producer, star salesperson, and they end up, everybody, the team goes to a bar for happy hour. It's outdoors, but it's dusk. Dusk is a sexy time. I don't know, it's not a sexy time, but everyone's had a drink at the company, and someone feels, they say something unpleasant to someone else that's not wanted. Now that we know we should have had this in place, what does it look like for the founder to manage that person, both parties? What is the way to approach it?
So I'm going to give two answers. One is to sort of address the end that so wonderfully covered already, and that is the pre-part, where you decide as the founder what is and isn't okay for you. What I always encourage founders to do is to have that discussion openly with your whole entire team, and to have that again every time you hire someone new, because you do need it to be super, super clear, not just, hey, you signed this form, tough beans on you, but to actually have that conversation. And I like to, again, refer back to rules of engagement to say, okay, there's a variety of scenarios where we may interact with each other as a team. What is okay? What do we decide as a team is okay behavior, knowing that there's a limit law-wise, which Jeannie covered, that you cannot go below. It doesn't matter if you as a team agree that, it's okay if everyone grabs body parts, no. You can't have it drop below the legal limit, shall we say. But once you've agreed there and above, where is that as a team? And then as a team, I like to say, what will the results be if one of us crosses that? Is it zero tolerance and you're fired immediately when it's discovered? Or, is there some sort of complaint strategy, and who is that person? And make that very, very clear to each and every person on your team as each person joins your company, so that it's super clear to everybody and everyone has had the chance to invest in it. And you're going to learn very quickly as someone comes on board if you're likely to have a problem. So like, well, it really isn't that big of a deal. No, if everyone on the team agrees that no, that is a big deal, then you can't do that. Are you going to be okay with that? Or is this something that you'd like to step out of and not join our firm, not join our company? It is sometimes a good clarification when someone's first joining. Obviously, you can back that up even to the interview process to say, this is how our corporate culture, this is how our company culture works. Are you going to be okay with that? Sometimes, someone's not likely to be as honest during that part of it, but you can put it that far back in the process. So that's something that I highly recommend, is really communication, be super open, get everyone to buy into it, recognizing if there's any disagreements and how can you resolve those things up front is much easier than after somebody has grabbed somebody at a, happy hour or something like that. If that happens and you have done the work, then obviously everyone knows what's going to happen next. If you haven't, you're just hearing this for the first time and you're like, oh shoot, we have a happy hour tonight, in fact. And what if something happens? I am going to use the example of someone that I very much respect, who has his own very successful company that he started about 30 years ago. And he shared a story about one of his employees was actually sexually harassed by one of his biggest clients. And
Wow.
he heard about it, not from the employee, but from somebody else. And he called up that client and he said, we will no longer do business. Period. End of story. And he shares that was a really big decision for him because it was a big financial hit for his company. But now that person that was sexually harassed by that client is his incredibly loyal employee that has worked for him all of these years and has stuck with him even during lean times, because she knew that he had her back. And I think the long range implications of actually helping your employees feel like they have a safe environment is worth making some of those sacrifices, which may be a financial hit to start with, to maintain the type of company culture that you want for everyone, so that they feel safe, so that they feel comfortable. And so, yeah, that's a really big decision, but it is something that I will tell you, even just having heard that story, I respect him so much more. So there are people that I refer to him simply because I know he has that level of integrity. So the ripple effect of making those difficult decisions, I always think is the right choice. Even if it means a really big pinch up front, the people who remain in your company are going to know that they can be safe, even at a company event.
I love that. And thank you for that really great example. So to dig into that a little bit deeper for both you and Jeannie, if you were going to have this initial conversation, you're a company and you're like, hey, it's time that we really set some ground rules about how we engage with each other. What would that conversation look like? And what do you expect from, is it just a leadership team who comes together to form this? Or is it truly, your team of 10, your team of 12 people? What does that look like? And how would you kind of kick that conversation off so people don't just laugh it off or shrug it off?
So obviously I come at it from the legal perspective, and what I would do is I would sit down and clearly kind of go over what the legalities are. But as Elaine so correctly noted, there are some behaviors that may not be technically illegal, but like in the sexual harassment field, it's not a slice and dice view of behavior. Behavior is looked at globally. So while one thing standing alone might not do it, a whole constellation of behavior might do it, and that may not be limited to just one person. We've had cases where judges have been pretty upset looking at like the whole company, the whole company culture. So certainly going over, there are some behaviors that are totally obvious, physical assaults, but it could be a whole lot less than that. I'll give you an example. Right now, one of the hot issues in light of the Supreme Court case that came down in June of transgender issues has to do with misgendering. Okay. And that's a big deal, misgendering, and courts get upset about that.
Can you give a little bit of what constitutes misgendering?
Having a transgender person one way or another, and the supervisor either inadvertently or deliberately refers to the person by the person's birth, not other gender, and that's misgendering. We have a case like that right now, and courts are very upset. Looking at issues, it's so simple. Looking at bathroom issues, nobody likes to talk about this, but this is a big deal. It's so simple. Providing a unisex bathroom, talking about this, providing a unisex bathroom doesn't take away a bathroom from either gender. It just provides accessibility. I mean, these are issues.
Yes.
So there are states that have already protected transgender issues, but now Title VII protects it federally. So other states, other areas where it's not illegal under state or local law, I mean, they've got to take note. But so those kinds of issues, certainly going through certain kinds of legal issues, I think are important to talk about. Context is a big one, and I'll give you an example. There was an important case that came down. It's like in the racial field. So the Supreme Court came down many years ago and said, you can't refer to somebody as boy. You can't refer to an African American as boy and say that boy is a generic word. You can't do that. So my point is talking about some law that has evolved that make things pretty clear, and then talking about the issues that are not so clear and making a decision how, as a company, you're going to deal with it. And as to your question about who are we talking to, not just the founders and the, let's say, high level people, but I totally agree with Elaine, bringing everybody into, especially if you're a small company, as you're bringing people in, because that makes them feel engaged. Engaged people are less likely to be disgruntled. And
important in here, right? If you feel valued, and you have the proper channels, you don't tend to resort to taking legal action if you feel there are other measures you can take to find some kind of resolution. So can we dig into the transgender example a little bit from both of your sides? So let's say that you do have an instance where we'll be with Rose asked, what about bathrooms? So we're gonna dig into that in just a second. So how would you, if someone is misgendering, you put that in your HR document and you've said, hey, we are really inclusive, and that means we use the proper pronouns for people that they want, and someone does it anyway, how do you address that, from a leadership perspective, and to make sure that you are being delicate and that you are also conveying to the team we can learn from this situation?
Blaine?
Anybody? Yes, please.
I was just going to say, it's going to sound like I'm a broken record, but I do definitely think that having those conversations ahead of time, and as someone who is personal friends with a transgender person who I've known for most of my life, so before the transition to current, ask the person how they are most comfortable being referred to, what their preferences are, depending on where they are in the transition process, and ask them, how comfortable are you having an open conversation about it? Most of them, in my experience, have been very, very comfortable about it and are very welcoming to the conversation, but it does depend on where they are in the transition process. Earlier on does tend to be a little bit more uncomfortable, as things like voice changes and deciding which clothing choices to make, those kinds of things, as those are occurring for them, it's a little bit more uncomfortable. But staying in good communication with them about where are you at, what are you most comfortable with, and when they are ready, having that be a leadership team conversation to say, okay, this is where we're at. They're willing to answer any questions you might have, because some people do have questions that, maybe they don't necessarily know who to ask. And so getting those questions answered, and then having, again, the rules of engagement of how are we going to proceed forward, and what happens when someone doesn't follow those rules? How do we want to handle that so that everyone feels safe, everyone feels like this is a warm, welcoming community of people that are working together, and deciding how that looks going forward. Because in my mind, inappropriately referring to a transgendered person by the wrong pronoun is no different than walking up and saying something sexist to either gender. It's offensive, it's upsetting, and maybe it's not upsetting to you because you're not a transgendered person, but putting that in that example of if someone walks up to me and says, well, what do you know? You're just a woman. That's pretty offensive to me. And so to give those examples to other people so that they kind of get the sting of what that is like can sometimes help to let the leadership team know this is a big deal. This isn't just, whatever. What does it make a difference whether they wear a t-shirt today or a blouse tomorrow? That's what I encourage as far as the rules of engagement, and then being very, very clear that the consequences that have been agreed upon, those happen.
Stephanie, you're on mute.
Sorry, I got it. I'm back. So thank you so much for that breakdown. I want to ask one clarifying question and then give a little, just kind of go through those examples that you, or the kind of order of operation you just gave. And then Rose, we're going to answer your question. So if you had this happening at the workplace, what you're basically saying is you'd have a chat with the transgendered employee and ask them, even when they first get to the company, ask them what they're comfortable with, what stage of transition, how comfortable they are sharing with the rest of the team, so that there is this sense of like camaraderie and we all see and respect each other. Is that fair and correct?
Yes, because at least my experience has been with friends who are transgendered, where they are comfortable will depend on where they are in that transition process.
Okay.
Some of them are very comfortable saying, oh yeah, my surgery's next week. Some of them don't want it talked about until one day they show up and they are dressing and appear like a completely different gender than what people have been used to. So having that conversation with them, because it's a personal process. This is something that they are making choices, medical, surgical choices about how they are going to show up in the world, and being able to be supportive of that is very important so that they continue to feel safe as they go through that journey.
So then if they're comfortable discussing it, then how do you kind of share that with the rest of the team in a way that's respectful and that makes them, is there like any, and I'm not trying to like, is it a team meeting? Is it is it an email, or what does that look like where everyone feels respected and comfortable? Probably not an email. I saw faces.
Yeah, based on the look on my face, I'm going to say no on the email.
Okay, no email.
I think this is an in-person discussion.
Okay.
I'm going to say, to go back to your example of every Thursday, we're going to get together as a team. If you have a regular team meeting.
Love that. Yes.
That's when you would want to include anything that's important that needs to come up. And, if the transgender person is comfortable with it, saying we will be discussing transgendered, awareness, we will be, however the transgender person is comfortable with you saying that, I would use them as a guide for their comfort level so they feel very respected in this process. But I would include it in your regular, every single week, you're having good communication with your team in person, if at all possible, and definitely not sharing these kinds of details, which can be left up to interpretation and bias over an email. That would definitely, I think this especially is a delicate enough issue that it shouldn't be handled just in writing.
And so just kind of overarching really great practices that you've both shared with us. First and foremost, setting this kind of standard right out of the gate, having the HR documents, having the conversations with your new hires, being clear that this is what's not acceptable and there are consequences for this behavior, and getting buy-in from the team. And then when you have new team members, making sure they're comfortable sharing, especially if they're going through transition, that they're comfortable, that people are respectful. And I love that you said making if someone does violate that, giving them examples so they can relate to how it would feel. Like you wouldn't say to a woman and think it's okay. So wanted to recap that. And then Rose has some really great questions as far as what about bathrooms? Are corporates moving toward unisex bathrooms in Georgia? Is that legally happening? We know some states go back and forth on that. And then also from a corporate perspective, are you updating corporate directories so people know how to address them? Are there best practices and ways to relay that information?
So on the bathroom issue, this is a pretty hot area now, especially in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision over the summer. I think you're finding more and more companies having to address the necessity of having unisex bathrooms. It's a pretty potent argument when you focus on the fact that if you provide a restroom that is unisex, you're not taking away a restroom from either gender. This is a real issue, and there's a lot of litigation over this issue, and it's particularly potent because it opens the door to all kinds of emotional distress damages in all kinds of ways. Manifests physically if somebody can't use a restroom, or is getting penalized if they now have to use a remote restroom somewhere, and especially like for hourly employees who have to clock in, clock out. The ripple effect is significant. And I mean, now we're not talking about that in this situation, but just potentially the ripple effect is significant. So I think these are issues that they're much easier dealt with at the get-go and early on. But having the conversations themselves, being mindful, I think helps put founders way ahead than if they don't.
And specifically when it comes to Georgia, Jeannie, are you seeing that happen a lot, or is Georgia being, or just kind of what's going down in the state, from what you're seeing, the legal side of things? Oh, I think muted possibly.
So I can tell you from our own experience, we are seeing more transgender cases, and all kinds of the issues that I've raised, misgendering, restricted bathroom use, and judges actually find that appalling. I think we have yet to see, you asked particularly about Georgia, we have really kind of yet to see what the fallout is going to be and what the impact is going to be, because the Supreme Court's case, the case that was decided by the Supreme Court, there were several, and one of them emanated from Georgia here, and it was an adverse, right? It was an adverse decision. So we may now be seeing different decisions in Georgia in light of the Supreme Court.
And an eventual return to the workplace where we're not remote, and that will be something to watch. Rose had another really great question, and it was about how to have these discussions. Should discussions of a sensitive nature, like someone who's transgender and transitioning, should they be discouraged from happening in the workplace unless moderated by a trained professional? Are there some things startups, founders and leadership can do to have them and create that safe conversation?
Well, certainly, I think sometimes trained professionals can bring to bear, and I'm not talking about lawyers per se, but other kinds of consultants can bring to bear some biases, some common ways of acting that we're just not maybe aware of. And so from an information gathering standpoint, that could be very helpful. I certainly think that that should not, the absence of a trained professional should not prevent the conversations from happening. I think employees will be much, I agree with Elaine about engagement. I made a comment, I often say, and I think I've said this to both of you, in our practice, I've never had a client who would rather have a lawsuit than the job. Either a job that they've felt that they've needed to leave or they've been pushed out of. And I've never had a client who thought that the lawsuit was a better option.
So to that, I know we've talked about what it's like creating, kind of setting the tone from the beginning, creating those documents, making sure that we lead with and giving the proper space for these rules of engagement being set. What do consequences look like within a startup? You know, if you don't have an HR department to send someone to, what are some of the steps that we can take as a founder? You don't want to fire the person. You've hired the person because you believe in their talent and their skill. It's expensive. What are some of those consequences if they're not using the proper pronouns, if they're not being respectful, if they're making comments that are unwanted to fellow coworkers? Me?
Okay, so I can give a little bit of input on that. I just saw some statistics that were put out by the EEOC. So in their 2017 fiscal year, they collected $394 million from employers in damages. In their fiscal year 2018, that number went to $505 million. And that's not talking about us private attorneys, what we get. And I can tell you that damages in lawsuits, I mean, it can depend on the size of the company, but damages and where you're located, damages can be huge. The costs of litigation, there are substantial dollar costs of litigation. We're talking about, you know, minimally $50, $100, $150,000. You could litigate to pay to win, and that is often not insubstantial. And what sometimes people don't know are these statutes, the statutes that protect these issues that we're talking about. Those statutes shift attorney's fees so that if you lose, you could be paying your own lawyer and the damages and the plaintiff's lawyer's fees. And those can be huge. So, and then there are the non-financial, the non-obvious financial legal costs, decreased employee morale, bad publicity, the impact on your investors and potential investors, the potential loss of a talent pool. People don't want to touch companies that look bad or look, you know, where there's some question about how they do business and whether they value their employees, whether they're fair. So, just to say one more thing about this, the law doesn't protect against all kinds of unfairness in the workplace. And unfairness is not illegal. But a company that garners a reputation for being unfair and treating their employees poorly, that can hurt a company in ways equally as much in terms of lost talent, decreased morale, investor potential, than these issues that we're talking about that may be protected by statutes. And then, of course, there are states like California, which are good faith and fair dealing states, where fairness does matter.
So really important to have that perspective on what the consequences are for a company as a whole when you don't address the behavior, when you don't give people the proper communication channels to feel seen and to have some kind of ability to see the behavior rectified or a resolution enabled. So Elaine, what does it look like before we get that far? What does it look like for a founder, a leadership team? What do the consequences for employees that might be committing these behaviors? What are some basics that you can implement? Like, hey, this is the first time I've heard this about you. Next time, hey, you're still doing this. What does that look like for some small 12, 15, 20 employees?
So I'm going to use an example of a client that I have who has a fairly small firm and is very recently having an issue with one of her larger components of her leadership team. And she came to me and she said, I'm having this particular issue with this person. And we talked back and forth. And I said, well, from my point of view, you have a couple of options. One is you can go to the employee and say, this is how the company culture is. This is what you have agreed upon. These were the agreed upon consequences of these types of behaviors. What are you willing to do to reinvest yourself back into the company culture? What solutions can you think of to see if they will buy back into the process? Or this is the chance to realize, okay, they've gotten disgruntled for this, and this reasons. And my suggestion to her was, you need to go into this conversation being aware that the other option is, if you've decided this is no longer the place that you want to be, I need you to understand, I wish you the very best, but I need you to exit as quickly as possible, so to minimize the damage to the company that I have worked so hard to create. I think you need to be aware that that side of things is a possibility. Now, I'm going to step on this lightly because I have worked in a couple of different states, some of which are right to work states and some of which are an at-will state. And so in a right to work state, you have to prove your ability to fire someone. So step lightly, make sure you have consulted with legal counsel before you have this kind of conversation. But outside of that, if you're within your legal rights to have this kind of conversation, is to be aware that if you don't deal with this situation, even though it is expensive to replace somebody, even though you have invested a lot of time, effort, energy trying to cultivate the relationship to where it is, sometimes people get excited about a different company and they start going in their minds about, oh, well, I need to leave because I can make more money. And they just get to the place where they kind of want to leave, but maybe they're not ready to jump yet. So that's a little later than the moment you want to become aware of it. But if that is the case, going into that conversation saying, where to fork in the road, where are you at? If you're willing to rejoin the team, then what are you willing to do to invest yourself in the process? What solutions can you come up with to bring yourself back in line? Are you willing to do that? And how will I know that you are willing to do that? How are you going to hold yourself accountable? And I say a lot of accountability has to be on that person saying, these are the ramifications of this. And what would you like the team to know? Understanding that communication is so big in our company culture, and we will be having a discussion about where you're at with things versus, okay, when are you going to leave?
So I really want to break that down just a little bit because that was so much fantastic information. So really, really great, and a lot of really important strategy. So your first, you'd approach the conversation and you'd address the behavior, and then you'd give the employee them to have kind of the recognition they're not kind of following the rules of engagement that you've laid out from day one with documents and open communication, and then giving them the opportunity to offer solutions and recognize they're not living up to the standard that everyone has agreed upon. And then I love that you asked, are you willing to so basically you're asking them to recommit. So it's not you telling them, I need you to do XYZ. I really, really, I love that so much. And then, so what are some of those, now they said, these are the ramifications. I'm willing to do this, I want to make it right. And if they're not following through, what does that conversation look like? Is it, hit the road. Thanks so much. See you later.
It is up to you as a founder how you choose to have that conversation. And I told her, I said, you're the one who's going to deal with whatever consequences happen from this conversation, not me. I'm going to be at my house, doing my own thing. So this is on you to have that conversation and to be comfortable with however that ends for you, knowing your comfort level before you even have that conversation is what I told to her. So I do encourage the founder to go into that conversation understanding that you need to be okay with whatever the consequences of that conversation are, because the rest of your team is going to base future situations on, well, you handled it that way with Sue, Bob, Joe, whoever. And this is going to use a legal term, this is going to set that precedent for how things are handled in the future. And this is why it's so important to have been having those conversations ahead of time to say, this is what's going to happen. And if you have something that's unusual that then comes up, hopefully you can talk through it as a team. If the situation comes up, this is how we're going to handle it. But if you haven't had those conversations to say, what do you think the consequences of this kind of behavior should be? And what we as a team, what we as a company culture decide, is this something that we want as a part of our company culture? Or are we zero tolerance, it's not okay, and this is where, here's the door, we wish you the very best.
Something I think that founders struggle with is, if this is the first time you're leading a company or you're still learning how to manage people, which is its own, really difficult skill set to learn, how do you know how many chances to give somebody? Can they grow versus you want them to grow versus is there like, hey, this is just, they're not going to change, you have to let it go, versus, yeah, I can do it, I can change, I'm not going to be not so nice anymore.
And my brief answer to this is you decide together, you have them commit to what they're going to do, and you agree during that conversation, if you don't do this, then that's it. Or if you do this, then this. I think that's the time to have that. And I will say, huge kudos to every person who steps into that founder role, because doing a thing is very different than managing people or supervising people or leading a team of people to do that same thing. So kudos to you. Total respect for people who step into that. I definitely want to acknowledge your courage and just encourage you to just really, really step up on the communication and really talk to your team about it.
So we have a follow-up from Rose. This is two-part. So let's say that you do fire the perpetrator, their behavior hasn't been fixed or corrected, and they were really popular, and now that perpetrator's gone, somebody who's done something untoward, and now the employee who brought it to your attention is still there and might be ostracized. What's the best practice for bringing everyone together again?
So I'm gonna jump in on this one because this connects with some of that. So the best laid plans can go awry if you don't also include the person who has either forthrightly come and complained, or you've learned about it through the grapevine. Some of the gripes that we hear about all the time is, well, I don't even know if there was an investigation. I told them, but I have no idea what happened. Nobody ever came back and said anything to me. So there's no validation even of the issue that was brought to some higher up's attention. And people get very upset about that. And if you're giving somebody, let's say, another chance, depending on what the grievance is, you have to really evaluate what is the nature of that working relationship going forward between that person who you may let remain employed and the person who came to you, or about whose complaint you learned. I can tell you that statistically, around 50% or a little over 50% of all charges filed with the EEOC raise retaliation claims. So either retaliation standing alone or retaliation connected to some underlying discrimination. And here's the kicker. people oftentimes proving retaliation claims is easier than the underlying discrimination. I won't bore you with all the legal details, but the kinds of behavior that can be found to be what we call actionable, give rise to a claim, is way more lenient than what you need for discrimination. And just like in a nutshell, the lingo is any behavior that would have a tendency to chill making the complaint. So you legitimately need to change work hours around of your staff, and the complainer's work hours have been changed. But now that impacts how they can, whether or not they can pick up their kid at school. Well, they may go ahead and file a retaliation claim. I'm not saying they're going to win it. I'm just saying that different kinds of conduct potentially opens that door. So whatever actions are being taken vis-a-vis the perpetrator, I think it behooves even small companies and founders to think about the person who was the source of the complaint.
Just, I think another really salient example of is so important from the onset. Like, I didn't consider all the ramifications, because you're right, it impacts every single part. If you have to change someone's hours, their life, but if they're like, it's just a whole host of bad news that you'd want to circumvent if you had the communication channels early, and if you had the documentation and the advice early from the proper, whether it's an employment attorney or trained professionals who can help you. So I really, really appreciate that. And then just as far as we've covered so much ground and so many things that aware of and intentional about, are there some books or resources, podcasts that you recommend? Like, these are some great ways, if you don't have a ton of time or a ton of money, to orient yourself in some best practices?
I see that there are all kinds of there's all kinds of guidance online, which you can at least find the generic overview. It can raise people's awareness, at least as to the issues. And I think that at least is a starting point. I look online all the time, and there are a lot of people who are doing consulting. There's all kinds of HR stuff. At the end of the day, I go back to my central position now, that if you're spending the money to start your company and you have a certain budget, I think it behooves you, and you foresee your company moving forward, it behooves you to get the advice that you need in the same way you would do it for anything else. At least cover your bare bases. And at least that will alert you to issues that you should be thinking about going forward.
Elaine, any recommendations?
So I definitely agree. I'm trying to think of podcasts off the top of my head, but finding, if you get onto LinkedIn, there are a ton of podcasters on there who, I'm sure several of them cover how to have difficult conversations, how to be a better leader, how to be an effective communicator, those kinds of things. And definitely following people, reading their content. I don't think it would take super long searching on something like LinkedIn to find who's talking about the kinds of things you want to learn more about. And you can just quick follow them, and then it comes up in your feed. I also encourage founders that during some of those initial foundational conversations to have people go through some assessments of their personality, of their various habits, and then have those conversations about where they see that there's going to be disconnects. I encourage, and I know this is a little bit off of what you were talking about, but it is a takeaway point that I like to encourage, and that is to talk about the differences between how you like to receive information, how you like to receive feedback, how do you like to be rewarded? Because, if you have someone who sends big, long emails to someone who wants a brief text, that's going to be a disconnect, and that's going to be a point of fallout. If you have someone who really doesn't want to be highlighted in front of the entire team at the weekly meeting and you say, hey, stand up, everyone cheer, they are not going to want to do anything good for the rest of their existence because now they're super embarrassed. So those kinds of things. The other thing I just want to throw out that can help to address some of these problems early on is to have what I call the 10-minute 2-question conversation. And that is to have a set time with each of your, and you can limit it to your key employees if you have a larger company, but to each of your employees to have them come in and you answer 2 questions for them. And you know it in advance. This is the 2-question conversation. It's 10 minutes. This is not a go on a witch hunt session or anything like that. The 2 questions are, what is one thing that I am doing well? And what is one thing that I can improve on? And it sets up you, because you know your brain will go looking for information to support any decision you've made. So it sets you up as the leader to be looking for things that your team is doing well. And it also sets you up to say, how can I support them? How can I help them in ways that they can grow and become an even more valuable part of the team? And you frame it in those terms of saying, I want to catch you doing something good. And that's so important to me as a company culture leader, that I want us to be reaching out to each other and telling each other what we're doing well, and then also looking for ways that we can grow each other and empower each other to become even more valuable team members is something that I see as very, very valuable. So it's not necessarily something you can read about, but talking to your employees, knowing that it's a very short conversation and knowing that you're going to have that touch point each and every week, at least for your key employees, and then you can have your other leadership team do that for their employees, can help you identify when someone's feeling like they're starting to struggle, and you can catch those things earlier on. And then, of course, everyone likes to be appreciated. So having them know that every single week, my boss, my leader is going to tell me something that I'm doing really well is awesome.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. I just wanted to quickly just go over a couple of the main points that you left us with, so many gems, but I think just really quickly stating the importance of seeking the right legal advice from the very beginning. Just the people who know there's a reason why you need their help, because they can help you save money and headache and tears later. And it matters so much to have that open door policy, to have those meetings with new employees from the onset, not to bury that HR document, to make sure you've given it space and time to be processed and digested by the employees, having those weekly meetings where they can touch base with you, and that creates that sense of safety to really share what's on their mind, whether it's positive or something that's not going well, and then you can prevent it from escalating to legal issues. You're able to catch it early if you have that communication. And if you have those, the HR kind of stuff in place, the points that you want to cover as a company, and then having team buy-in, right? Ever so often regrouping, making sure these are the consequences. These are the things that we do, what we don't do, and these are the consequences. Are we in agreement? Making sure everyone is still on the same page, and making your employees feel valuable. And then I took tons of notes, so I just wanted to make sure I've got them covered here. Assessments like love languages, even an apology quiz, where you have a better sense than just asking an employee, hey, why don't you tell me about you? It gives you something to start the conversation with, a true sense of them. And again, you know, I loved, Jeannie, that you said you've never met somebody who'd rather have the job than a lawsuit. Everybody would rather keep their job. You'd rather be happy with your employer. You'd rather be respected and seen than have to go to the extreme of taking legal action. And that's so much because you didn't do what we just went through. Are there any other really key points you'd like to say one last time? Or did we about cover them all?
I have just something else, just with respect to performance issues. I think it's very important to think through an objective basis how you're going to measure performance and to communicate those in a concrete kind of way. So I'm sure we've all seen the performance scales, the 1 to 5 kind of thing, and I think that feeds into quite a lot of bias. It opens the door to quite a lot of biases. It becomes problematic both for employees and employers on both sides of a litigation. If there isn't a good fit, and really just there isn't, simply just saying you're not a good fit, that becomes problematic. While it is true that subjective assessments of somebody's performance, fit in a company, can be legitimate. It can be legitimate and is viewed can be viewed that way by a court. There still needs to be some kind of objective basis that an employer can articulate for that. And I think that again goes back to the inception. If you start to think about what qualities are important in terms of performance of a particular person in a particular role, and articulate those in kind of concrete, objective kind of ways, and make sure that you're not viewing them through, let's say, sexist lenses, for example. That's what I would just add to this discussion, because so many times, and I see this happens all the time, there may be something that's not illegal, a reason that's not illegal for an employer's action. And invariably, employers back into a performance defense. Invariably, that happens. You start having now somebody who's been an okay employee gets bad reviews or bad emails or things that are critical. They've never been a problem before. And if you don't have objective ways of articulating exactly what the issues were, and from the get-go, it can be problematic. I was doing some reading about this, and I think it's really good to to set evaluations by task. I think that's to think about a set of expectations for a particular project or a particular task or a particular role that someone is doing. So often, I'm sure if anybody has been in a large corporate situation, they see very generic methods of evaluation. Good communication. Well, what does that mean? And unless you can, first of all, I think words like that can potentially convey an undercurrent of sexism, and for all the reasons that communication styles are often, they're just viewed differently, male and female, and I have that opinion. But I think that really being specific about what you're looking for and communicating that to your employees. So oftentimes employees get frustrated when they don't know exactly what's being expected of them, or they're not trained properly. That's another big thing. People training is not productive. It doesn't pull the dollars in. But if you're not training somebody properly for the job you want them to do, they're going to be frustrated, they won't perform well, and I think that's penny wise and pound foolish, not to invest those resources that way.
Extremely aptly put. Thank you so much for that really great feedback. It's not something that I've considered, and I'm sure to not be vague, to have clear metrics when it comes to those performance evaluators, to avoid a world of hurt for yourself and your employees. Really appreciate you sharing that. Anything else anybody wanted to chime in? Any questions as we close out this incredibly insightful panel?
Well, thank you. Again, Stephanie, you've done a fabulous job moderating, and Jeannie has added such huge value from her legal background, which I really appreciate hearing as well. I was just going to add that one of the things you can do as a founder, and it's up to you, but you can, as part of the weekly meetings that you have, is to say, okay, so obviously we're going to need to do performance appraisals. How do you want to handle those? And what's your preference about what it's based on? And can we find a way that feels respectful and that feels supportive and empowering to have those conversations happen? And what do we base it on? You can make it, especially when you're a small team, you can make it a team decision to say, this is how we're going to handle those. Obviously, again, everything I say is on top of, it has to be minimum standard of the legal ramifications that Jeannie has spoken about so well, is on top of that to say, how do we want to handle those so that people don't feel that they're unfair, that people don't feel like they're discriminatory. And sometimes that can really help to alleviate some of those, I don't know how I'm going to be evaluated. Actually, you were part of the discussion about how you're going to be evaluated. And you can also have the conversation about, and what happens if you meet expectations or exceed expectations? What does that look like? An interesting discussion I've had with several of my client firms is to say, how do people want to be rewarded? Do they want a bonus, or do they want an extra vacation day, or do they want, time with the boss once a week for the first month of the year, or whatever it is? Different people have different things that really speak value to them. And deciding as a team, what do you want? And does everyone agree that if that's something different, are those equivalent? Can sometimes really make it feel personalized and still fair. Just as a suggestion to throw it out there, you don't necessarily, as long as everyone agrees, you don't necessarily have to do the same thing for everybody. Like, okay, everyone gets a 2% raise. Those kinds of things. You can make it individualized, and that can be a lot more personally rewarding to somebody if your whole team agrees that that's okay.
I love that. That is fantastic. Something I had also never considered. And to your point, everybody does have a different way that they want to be rewarded and included and seen. So I hope we didn't lose Elaine, but
Am I
if
frozen?
we, I think video gone.
Oh, let's see. I can still see.
So this feels like a great time to wrap up now that we have visually lost, but we are connected beyond video. Virtually, we are more than connected now. Eli, thank you so much for saying and hear you. Okay, so friends can still, audience can still see you and hear you, even if I can't. Last call for any questions from the audience, anything that you have on. Thanks, organizer and Adam. Any other questions before we wrap up this really important, timely session?
If Stephanie, you can still hear me, can you still hear me or no?
Everyone, yes, we see you. I can see you and hear you, and everybody else could except me.
So Rose had asked a question that I just wanted to touch on briefly about how our organization's changing how they refer to people. I think this was in reference to the transgender topic that we covered. Is one of the ways you can do it, just to make it very broad sweeping and not pointing out the one transgender person, is if it's okay with everyone, you can have everyone have pronouns listed. And you'll see this on social media, that after someone's name, they'll say she, her, or he, him, those kinds of things, or they, them. You can just put that in the company directory. So it's right there. No one will have any excuse to misuse the pronouns that are appropriate. Just wanted to touch on that real quick.
Thank you. Fantastic and really important. And that way it takes away who adds it. Just it's a blanket. Everyone has to follow these best practices. I think that about does it for us. Thank you so much to our panelists, Jeannie Marks and Elaine Jacques, for taking their time, so valuable to share their expertise, their knowledge, and that hopefully that we become better leaders and build better companies and create more employees and really just keep it going the right way in technology, which we haven't always done so well, but here we are, ready to take 2021 by storm. Thank you for your guidance. Could not do it without you. Thank you to Ali and Adam for putting this together and bringing us together, and Techstar Startup Week Atlanta. Thank you for having us.